Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Angie Stevens, and I hope you're enjoying the second week of the conference. So, welcome to this Lunch and Learn session LE. Please use this code for the feedback after this session is finished. We are supporting two charities this year, Lifeboats and Guide Dogs for the Blind. If you're enjoying the conference, please donate to these wonderful charities. Please post any questions in the chat and they will be answered by Edward after the presentation or during if there's a break. And one last thing, this session is being recorded. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Edward Shim of BMC. Edward is the Senior Product Owner for BMC AMI Security. Today, he is talking about SecOps, SOAR, and the mainframe. Why is it so hard? So with no more ado, I'll hand over to Edward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone, or I should say good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm sure it's the lunch hour for many of us, so I do appreciate your time and taking the time out to join our talk today. So yeah, my name is Edward Shim. I'm the Senior Product Owner for BMC AMI Security. Just to introduce a little bit about myself and to share a bit about my background. What I do is I lead the product roadmap for AMI Security. I help to make sure that our products are headed in the right direction, are really answering customer needs and customer demand for what is really helping them in the security space, specifically with the mainframe. And prior to that, I was helping to lead the security operations for a large SOC, Security Operations Center in Southern California. And that was a really, really valuable experience to see just what a SOC goes through, what some challenges are, and really a lot of things that are relevant to our talk today. And what are some things that make a SOC successful when you're integrating new data, such as the mainframe? How can we make that work more smoothly? And what are some difficulties behind that? Because as we know, security operations, which we'll discuss what the definition of is here in a second, it's very important today, but certainly there's some challenges that come with it. And today the goal of our talk is to provide some really practical solutions, some things that you can bring back to your organization, some key pieces of advice or perhaps knowledge or practical tools that you can bring back and say, hey, you know, there's something that I recall from this talk that I think we can really use back at our organization as we're looking to really join security and mainframe together. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. So let's get right into the definition of security operations. It is exactly what it looks like. It's the marriage of security and operations, or the integration of that. And you know, I think depending on who you ask, the word SOC traditionally comes to mind, which stands for Security Operations Center, which, as I'm sure most of us know, is where the brain and the operations of an enterprise's security happens. It's where you have your SOC analysts, have your leads, your engineers coming all together to ensure that you have visibility and detection within your environment. But when we're talking about the mainframe and security operations, we're talking more about the marriage and the integration of two usually disparate teams. That is mainframe operations and security operations, right? The SOC and the mainframe, and joining those two together. And so it's a kind of a unique context in the mainframe. So again, as I mentioned earlier, I worked in specifically security operations. And so I know firsthand that the importance of the SOC to the enterprise, and that also can vary. But again, I think with recent years, when you think about things like ransomware, and you think about just the headline that cybersecurity is kind of dominating now, it's certainly growing in importance, some challenges. And if you told me that we had a critical asset in our enterprise that we didn't have visibility on, but we needed visibility, and if it were compromised, that would be absolutely detrimental to the business, to the reputation of the business. Well, I would ask, why aren't we looking at it? I would ask, why has this risk not been quantified to me yet? Or why am I just hearing about this now? Something along those lines. So we know that the mainframe is not on an island anymore. And we know that there's some way that we need to increase visibility on it, not just for mainframe operators, but for people whose job it is to monitor critical assets. But the question is, it's much harder than it actually turns out to be when we actually try to integrate a brand new asset into our SOC, into our security operation. And the question often becomes is, okay, I know that this is very difficult. I know it's very, very challenging, but then how can we do it, right? And then how can we address those challenges? So just to give you a quick number on what's actually happening today in mainframe organizations when it comes to security operations. So a large majority of companies say their SOC knows when credentials are modified. That's fair. I think any SOC would say, yeah, absolutely, we have visibility when some of the credentials are modified. Sure. But then we see 39% still experience when someone's credentials are being elevated, or in other words, when someone may be escalating their privileges without someone knowing it. And so there's a bit of a disparity there. So yes, we know, but yet this is still happening. And with that in mind, we see that SOCs aren't necessarily perfect, right? And on top of that, of the security organizations that we've interviewed, that only 41% are taking steps to actively secure their mainframe, less than half. So what's the point there? The point is that even now, SOCs have this high level of confidence for when it comes to things like escalating their privileges, yet it's still happening. And on top of that, they are also not being able to see everything that's happening on their mainframe. So it's very clear that the mainframe is a blind spot. There is something that needs to happen here to help the mainframe integrate into the large security operation. So, and I can also say that even when a SOC is mature, right, even when a SOC has all these alerts and detection mechanisms in place, right, it's still a challenge. It's still a challenge. So, for example, when I was helping to lead our SOC back in a few years ago now, every time we would implement a new rule into our environment, there would be thousands of alerts from just one log source, right? And so you would think that, oh, well, it's simply, you just have to implement more detection rules. You just need to do this and that. There's usually steps along the way that you have to consider before just kind of turning on the lights, so to speak, or connecting the plugs between the mainframe and the SOC. And that's some of the things I want to highlight today. As I wish it was as simple as, hey, just implement more detection rules in our SIEM. Let's just turn on the lights. Let's just connect two things. There's certainly other implications that we need to consider and to make sure that we're aware of before we really join the two teams together and think about how we're joining them. So what are some typical challenges in the context of mainframe and security for SecOps and when we're joining these two teams? Well, the first, of course, is collaboration. In other words, actually getting two teams to work together and getting those structures to make sense within your organization. And to really kind of underscore this point, as I said earlier, in most SOCs, I would wager if you ask them who ran the mainframe, let's say you ask the security team who ran the mainframe, you might get a bit of a blank look. You might get some pause, say, well, I think it's this person. But what if we had a shared space, for example, where you could share work? So the analogy I like to use is the conference room. So before we, of course, went largely to remote work and remote work became much more of the norm, how would we normally collaborate? Well, we would go to a conference room. We would have a shared space, somewhere where we could share our thoughts and ideas in one space and even delegate tasks to one another. That looks a lot today like an ITSM platform, things like, of course, BMC Helix. We have things like ServiceNow, traditionally back in the day, Remedy. So the question here is, what if there was a way to practically integrate two traditionally siloed teams in a way that helped both? So that's just one way of how we can help collaboration, because we know it's a challenge when we're talking about two separate teams, two separate structures. Another challenge is tools. It's not a mystery that mainframe tools and distributed tools are night and day. They are very, very different, and the security space is no different as well. So the story often is in a SOC and in the mainframe, well, the SOC will use their tools and the mainframe will use theirs. But what if we had tools that were shared by both teams? Or the mainframe could send us data that we could use in our tools much more readily. And what if I said, for example, hey, mainframe team, we'll help you out, but you need to help us know what to look for and how to look for it. And that's really honestly a solid first step when we're trying to bring these two teams together to collaborate. So really looking at solutions that can best enable this off-platform data shift is key. And I kind of look at it as connecting a pipe. So if you're looking for a plumber, for example, to connect your pipe, sure, they might get water from point A to point B. It'll come out of the faucet. And that's all that matters, right? But what if a plumber knows about the water content, or that the quality isn't what it needs to be, or that there's going to be future issues, but as long as you get the data there or the water there, you'll be happy, right? You would want that plumber to tell you, or you'd want to get the best service possible when you're connecting those pipes. And that's the analogy that I want us to kind of remember, is that just moving data isn't enough. Just saying you're getting data from point A to point B isn't quite enough. There needs to be some due diligence in what are we doing with that data, and how is it formatted, and what use cases is it meeting. And these are all things we'll talk about. But again, that's just kind of an analogy I want to put forth to kind of illustrate the point that, when we're thinking about the tools that we're using, let's really make sure that we are approaching that analysis of the tools very thoughtfully. And then finally, we have Finally, we have processes. Finally, we have processes, which is referring to oftentimes things that are done on the mainframe, or even in the SOC, it's done manually. So what this speaks to is, when we're looking at processes between the two teams, the communication often is something new for both teams. But what if we had ways to kind of automate workflows? And again, this speaks to different tools like ITSM, where we're able to have that shared workspace, or that shared delegation of tasks, where both teams suddenly are able to work on the same space. So these are just some of the challenges that we'd like to highlight today. So a question you might be asking is, okay, we know it's important, but let's talk about why it's so hard. Like, why specifically is it so hard? And then how can we address that? So the first one we're going to talk about is differences in terminology. And again, if you told me years ago in a previous role that, hey, go check out that LPAR, or go check out that data set, make sure there's no issue in those KICS transactions, I would probably, give you a bit of a blank stare. I would say, I'm not certain what you're talking about. But if you told me that, hey, there's a log source that has some data that you need to investigate, here are the log files, and here is some context, you can contact me if you need some help with the context when you're investigating this, then I have something to work with, right? And I understand it's somewhat to that semantics, but really that's a step that really helps to communicate that two teams are working together, that I'm trying to meet you halfway, or that the person I'm working with is trying to meet me halfway and helping me understand something. So the challenge is that a lot of mainframe data that's being sent off platform doesn't do this simple step of pre-processing before it goes to a SOC. And as a result, we're giving ourselves in security a lot of added friction as a result. The second challenge we have is differences in technology. And what I mean by technology is that when I go back to the analogy of the plumber connecting the two pipes, or the data pipes rather, meaning moving mainframe data off platform to, let's say, your enterprise analytics engine like AMI Command Center. But truth be told, not all pipes are created equal, and not all integration or translation tools are necessarily created equal. And I think we all know that tools should make life easier for everyone, both the owner of the tool and the recipient. And the security heavy lifting should be done by the tool. So what I mean by that, let's use an example. Let's use the example of let's call them vendor A and then vendor B. So vendor A will provide, let's call them out-of-the-box alerts related to data, to single record data, just blocks of messages, and it'll provide these alerts and detect just very simple changes. But they'll say, we have X number of out-of-the-box alerts that will help you maintain full visibility and provide over 40 detection capabilities in your mainframe. All true, right? Factually, that's all true. The question is how it's doing. Now, if you look at vendor B, that has, again, out-of-the-box alerts related to data taken from multiple sources, compared against normalized behavior, and it's predictive, right? Which would you take, right? But the question often becomes are we doing more than just kind of checking the box, so to speak, when it comes to detection? Or are we really thinking about what is the depth of the technology that we're looking at when it comes to detection and response, right? So if we're just, both are doing detection in this example of vendor A and vendor B, but again, there's differences in how they're doing that. That's just a small example, and we'll talk about that more. And then the last challenge is reluctance and skepticism, I call it, on both sides. By both sides, I mean security operations, our traditional security team in the enterprise, and mainframe operations. And this is fair. This is a very fair challenge. And the mainframe is a crucial space, but when it comes to security, it's often considered niche, a bit of a niche space, which is ironic considering its importance. But the security team might say, mainframe, well, what about our servers in the cloud? Well, you probably have some databases on your mainframe you need to worry about first. And who's going to help you? But the mainframe might say, security, we are secure. The mainframe's impenetrable, And we've seen time and time again that there's quite a few security misconceptions when it comes to the mainframe. And one example is a customer that our services team did a penetration test on, and very quickly they were able to get into their environment and discover some very severe vulnerabilities, to the point that they had to actually stop that penetration test and inform the customer of the severity for the customer's benefit. And then the conversation became, well, we need help, and that's okay. But it's again to underscore the point that maturity in an industry, or maturity even in the mainframe space, does not correlate to security. And I think sometimes security of the mainframe. And I think sometimes that's a difficult misconception to address, but it's something that's still very relevant today. All right. So let's get right into our reasons and some specific examples and specific steps forward, and practical steps, I should say, that will help and that you could bring back to your organization. So as we said, our first reason was differences in terminology. And when we have these two parties of mainframe operations and security operations, we have, of course, our mainframe operators, but the other half of this story is our security analysts or security team. And often that first level of detection and response when it comes to security is our traditional security analysts, right? So a question we really want to ask is, when we're sending data off platform, is can our security analysts understand what they're looking at? Or at least are we giving them some sort of way that they can begin to understand what they're looking at, or they can at least take the research on their own to try and understand? And this is actually an iterative process of tuning. It's not a set it and forget it. And I think that's one thing to emphasize here, is that any detection and response solution, whether it's a SIM, you have a SOAR platform, which we'll get to, any security analytics platform is continually tuned, right? It's continually tuned. And it's a collaborative effort between two teams that are trying to get the most, or really derive the most value from data that's being sent to them. So as I said, the security analyst is the other half of the story. And the question we want to ask is, can they even understand what they're looking at? And if they don't at first, or if maybe they have a question, or maybe it's not immediately clear, how are we iterating on what's being sent to them? So one way to practically help with this, of many, is looking at solutions or tools that allow for some level of customization, or allow for some level of a bespoke type of alert or information that can be universally understood as much as possible between the mainframe team and the security team. Oftentimes, let's just use vendor A and vendor B as an example. Let's say vendor A, as we said earlier, will say, hey, we have these number of out-of-the-box alerts that just detect on a single record, and they just send them as is. And if you want to change it, or if you want to, let's say, change how it's formatted, well, tough luck. I mean, it is what it is, and it's the intelligence that we provide you. That's actually true, right? That actually is kind of the level of flexibility you might see when you're looking at different detection and response solutions in this space. However, if you had some flexibility to say, you know, we really want to add more context to our alerts, we really want to change the type of data that it's using, or criteria rather, that it's using to generate these alerts. You want that flexibility, because that's what any security team would be looking for as well, is if it's not as accurate as we thought at first, or if the data isn't as useful as we thought at first, how can we tune it so we're not inundated with data? Or how can we provide feedback to the mainframe team who can then help us tune it so it's as useful as possible? Because we want our SOC to understand that data. So bottom line is, when you're looking at data pipes and how data is being sent, look at your data pipe closely during those POCs and those solution analysis. And so going back to our point in data being sent off platform and not all pipes necessarily being created equal, consider very closely how you can pre or post process data. In other words, how can you filter data? How can you leverage it for alert purposes? How can you control the rate of ingestion, which affects cost, right? So one example, again, just use vendor A and vendor B. Vendor A might send a raw unformatted data, let's say to your SIM. But the question we really want to ask is, what are we looking at? Like the security team, the first question I want to ask is, what is being sent and what are we looking at right now? What's the context behind this, right? What am I, as a security team member, supposed to do with this data? And the baseline assumption is that they have no mainframe experience, right? Whereas you have vendor B that's generating alert tickets to that SIM or ITSM to let the security team know that, hey, this is what we're looking at. This is the challenge we're dealing with. Or, hey, this is something you need to investigate. So data sent from the platform should be formatted and filtered, right? And you need to have control in this process. That's something that needs to be emphasized, is that when we are considering how to translate terminology, when we're considering how to send data off platform, how much autonomy can you exert when you say, hey, you know, I think this would be useful for us. I think this would be useful for our security team, versus, you know, there's a minimal amount of formatting you can do. There's a minimal amount of filtering or ingestion control you can do. So these are definitely questions to consider when looking at sending the mainframe or sending data from the mainframe off platform. And also related to this point of differences in terminology, if you recall, we used that analogy of the conference room, of how ITSM solutions like ServiceNow, BMC Helix are ways to get two teams kind of in the same conference room, right? In the age of remote work, we know how hard it is sometimes to collaborate across disparate teams. It's only become, I think, even more challenging. And certainly remote work has tons of great benefits. It's been really a great help to the remote, to many of us in IT. But as we know, it can be harder and harder to collaborate. So just to give you an example, I remember as a security lead, when I was working on an incident that involved 3 teams. So for example, our network team, our user experience team, and of course the incident response team. And you know, there was no way that we could have tracked each other's conversations, notes, work, or progress without ITSM. And this is pre-pandemic, of course. So there was no barrier to walking up and down the hall, the stairwell, to knock on someone's cubicle, things like that. And even then, it was very, very difficult to collaborate, right? So, but having an ITSM platform like BMC Helix, right, it helped us delegate tasks to each other and notify each other automatically, right, when something was complete, or notify each other automatically when we had a question, right? And it really was a lifesaver when I look back on it. And mainframe and security operations is no different, right? It's no different. I really can't emphasize this enough, is having some way to share work, having some way to share communication between each other. That's what ITSM excels at. It excels at bringing two teams and uniting them to make sure that they're on the same page, so to speak. And as we show in the slide, it's really transformed 2 siloed teams into one cohesive SecOps team. So what we see here in the screenshot, of course, Helix ITSM, but there's multiple ITSM solutions out there that really do help drive alignment between multiple teams across your organization, not just 2, but your entire organization. All right, so we had differences in terminology. The second reason I'd like to point out is differences in technology. It sounds similar, but here's the minor difference. So we're not just looking at how can I make the data useful. Ask the question, how am I sending that data, right? How can it be more useful to our SOC, right? So what kind of capabilities does our tooling have in order to make data more useful for our SOC? So beyond just kind of translating terminology, we want to focus on different things like, how am I enriching data, right? How am I really transforming data, right, to ensure that it's of the most use for the recipient, in this case, our security analyst. So beyond just kind of connecting the pipes, as we said, when it comes to security, you really need some mainframe security expertise or domain expertise, right? So again, going back to the analogy of vendor A and vendor B, right, where we talked about things like looking at single record or just configuration changes versus looking at suspicious or predictive activity, right? Those are 2 vendors that might claim to do the same thing, but they are very, very different in terms of the kind of intelligence they're providing to the end user. And the end user is both the mainframe operations team and the security team. And just to give you an example of the importance of this, I think one way that I could summarize it in one sentence is that not all data is created equal. Not all data is created equal. So I remember when I was monitoring our SIM, and every time we ingested a new log source, I would ask myself, do we first determine, whether or not this data would be useful? And if not, I would turn it off. I would turn it off because it would inundate our SIM with alerts, with so many alerts. So you can imagine at the scale of the mainframe what might happen, depending on how much data you're sending, of course, but it's still a log source. At the end of the day, your security team is going to view it as another data source, right? Log, mainframe, web server, whatever it is, right? So Did we determine if it's useful? And if not, I would turn it off. And of course, perhaps face the wrath of a colleague who put it in just a bit too prematurely. But when they heard my case for it and why I did that, it helped us really mature as an organization. It helped us be far more judicious about what we're ingesting and what we're looking at. And so when it comes to the mainframe, again, I think every solution out there will tell you, we send you the messages you need. We send you the messages you need. Every solution out there will say that without fail, right? Full stop. But messages are only as good as specificity of the data within them, right? Especially when it comes to things like security operations. Because if an analyst can't really pivot quickly in an investigation with what they're looking at, or if there aren't pre-processing capabilities for data or posts, for example, parsing out fields and existing messages on your analytics engine once it's received, you will be inundated with mainframe messages, and your SOC will most likely say to turn them off, or worse, ignore them altogether. And that's going to result in a blind spot, which is definitely what we don't want. So ensure to vet the quality of messages being sent from the mainframe, what they're being used for, confirm that, and how, again, going back to that iterative tuning process, and how they can be refined by getting that feedback from your security team. So how are messages more useful? How are messages more actionable where a security analyst can do that? It's when they have things like indicators of compromise. It's when they have additional data. It's when both security and mainframe teams can derive value immediately, right? Rather than just look at a blob of text that's sent from the mainframe, however many each second, right? Strictly speaking, that may, for example, check the box. Hey, we're sending our data to an analytics platform. We're doing it, right? The question is, what's happening once it's there? Like, what's happening and what is within that data to be useful for the security team? So the bottom line is, you really consider solutions that have security indicators and expertise baked in. That the ultimate goal, the first and foremost goal of that data that's being sent, is to meet a specific security use case, and to help the recipient do some sort of follow-on investigation and to really leverage that data for security purposes. All right, our third reason is reluctance on both sides. And notice I said both sides. It could be one or the other, right? It's not just mainframe, it's not just security. Usually it's some measure of both. And there's three things I want to highlight here on this topic. We'll spend a little bit on this slide, but I think it merits a bit of discussion. So the first question or point I want to talk about is this idea of security by obscurity. I think in the mainframe security space, it's something I hear almost daily. And perhaps we've heard this all the time and heard variants of it, such as security by obscurity is no security at all. And I want to say that is not true. It is still one layer of security. Obscurity is still one layer of security. Hiding out of plain sight or not being very visible, these are still a layer of security. That said, thinking obscurity alone is a mature security posture or strategy is not correct. So here's an analogy. So in the military, when I was, back in my younger days, I guess, is in the military, we were always taught that in the event that there's a threat, to seek cover first, right? And if no cover is available, to try and seek some sort of concealment. Why? Because concealment will not stop bullets. So it's the same way with the mainframe, right? If an attacker gets privy on the data-rich environment of the mainframe and starts to target it, are you really going to only rely on the concealment of, well, they don't know about us, and they can't see us yet. They'll never learn the basics of mainframe fast enough, as your only or primary layer of protection. So that's why the mainframe needs a hardened security posture or cover, to continue that analogy, and not just the concealment of security by obscurity. So I think that is important to talk about, because I think that does add to quite a bit of the reluctance on both sides, not just mainframe, not just security. The second thing I want to talk about why SecOps is very hard, and relating to this reluctance point, is misconceptions. So security misconceptions. And I think there's a bit of a running list on mainframe security conceptions that to this day we still receive from very, very experienced mainframe personnel. Here's just a couple anecdotes. So for example, I've been told that the mainframe has nothing like the root user. And that's factually false. I mean, you have super users on the mainframe, you have UID 0. Yet this is something that I've heard, and I've had to kind of had a back and forth on why that was not the case. Another thing that we commonly hear, very, very common, is we have RACF or whatever ESM the organization might be running. And yes, I agree. RACF is a fantastic identity access management IAM tool, but I have to disagree that no, having RACF inherently does not mean you are secure from any sort of compromise or intrusion. You need to test it. You need to test it. And all too often, there are gaps that could be closed, but that they're not. So unless you're actively pen testing your system, are you really certain that you have the full picture, that you have every gap, every possible misconfiguration covered? And also every other system has an IAM system that is arguably just as good, yet we still see hacks and compromises on mainframe and non-mainframe systems like every day. So again, this is just something that I wanted to highlight there. Another, excuse me, another thing I'd like to highlight is we also hear that, yeah, but it would never happen. You need very, very rare, very rare, scarce programmer skills that take decades to develop just to hack a mainframe. And no, that's not true. You can just as easily drop into Unix as a privilege or USS as a privileged user and damage the system using Linux commands, or do the reconnaissance you need with no mainframe experience, right? And Linux is, as we know, it's widely known, it's widely used. So I think there's a misconception that one needs to know everything's EOS to potentially compromise and damage a EOS system. So perhaps, and I don't think that's true. And so I think perhaps there's a term that some of us are familiar with, and that's the term script kiddies or script kiddies. And we know we've heard it in the distributed world, but it also applies to the mainframe. Well, it applies to any system. Really, the concept is that there's so much automated tooling and open source knowledge when it comes to things like offensive security and hacking that to damage a system or to learn how to potentially damage a system simply requires just a certain measure of dedication and time to that topic and to learn a little bit about that topic, right? Mainframe or otherwise. So there's certainly a learning curve with mainframe, but there is a learning curve with any system. It just so happens that the curve with mainframe doesn't happen to be as mainstream or as accessible. I think that's a fair statement to say, right? I mean, for example, when's the last time you saw a coding boot camp for COBOL or JCL, right? They don't exist, but that doesn't mean they're not learnable. It doesn't mean it's not easily acquired. And just to kind of paint this with a quick true story, there was a security analyst, a former security analyst, who joins a very large software company, very prominent in the mainframe space. And as he learned more about the mainframe, he thought, well, how hard is it to figure out how to do some bad stuff on the mainframe? Not because they wanted to do anything bad, but because they were naturally curious about security. And the best way to learn is hands-on, right? So like any good hacker, they started with open source intelligence, which is just a fancy term for Google or Shodan, right? It's just open source. And what he discovered was that you could log into the mainframe with, believe it or not, Telnet or SSH. So that was kind of the first step in seeing the mainframe isn't this huge esoteric iron beast, after all. So he learned how to get credentials, log in. Like any good hacker, he wanted to see how far the rabbit hole went. He wanted to see, could I become an administrative user, a power user, or escalate my privileges? And lo and behold, in the open source intelligence trove of mainframe hacking tools, he found one that abused APF authorized libraries to grant him special in operations. So was he a mainframe systems programmer? No, not at all. But was he someone with some security expertise, resourcefulness, and a lot of curiosity? Yes, absolutely. So from there, if you wanted to discover, let's say, how to pivot and recon additionally internally within the mainframe, what's considered core libraries, right? Are there password files that they can dump? That really would come down to resourcefulness and time, right? And he's already in. So I think the point that I'm trying to illustrate is that the information on mainframe isn't necessarily hidden away in Fort Knox, but sometimes in the mainframe space, one might think it is, right? But that's not necessarily the case. So again, this person wasn't a hacker. They didn't have malicious intent. They were just very curious. They were just a very curious security person. And of course, they learned about the mainframe a lot in the process. So yeah, that person actually, was me. And I think that's why I'm very, very adamant on this idea behind, or this conception that, the mainframe is inherently secure, things like that. And why that's not true is because I've seen firsthand that it's not true. So I think my ultimate point behind all this is that, yeah, there's many misconceptions that still exist today, but knowing why necessarily they're not true or why they exist will help us as we kind of go back to organizations and have discussions around these topics. All right, that's a bit of a long point. Thank you. So finally, when it comes to reluctance and why it exists and why it's so difficult to kind of overcome sometimes, is the fact the reality is that sometimes security just does not want to deal with mainframe. I mean, there's no other way to say it. It's a tough reality that I'm sure many of us who are perhaps mainframe operators have seen when we're trying to integrate security initiatives or join the mainframe to a security initiative. They might say they do, but I think it's a bit more difficult than that, right? So the tough reality is that, as much as it is difficult to say, is that this really has to be addressed at a leadership level, because each team, mainframe operations and security, absolutely needs a champion. They absolutely need a champion. Otherwise, it will be very, very difficult to gain traction in integrating the mainframe seamlessly with security. And nothing really gets the top level's attention, the C-suite's attention, like some high visibility risk. That's the language that the executives speak. That's the language that your CISO or your CIO will speak. And the question then becomes is, how can we demonstrate that risk? Well, I mean, this is a perfect segue into our next slide. So how do we demonstrate risk? We quantify it. We produce the hard copy report. We show the screenshots. We show the panels of this. These are your severe vulnerabilities. As we said in our customer story earlier, they had to stop the penetration test midway just because the vulnerabilities were so serious and they had to be addressed immediately. So demonstrating mainframe vulnerability and the importance of security. And this is in the form of security assessments. That's kind of more of a health check for the mainframe, or even something even deeper that really tests the resilience and the posture of the mainframe, like the penetration test by our services team, which, by the way, and I understand that every vendor says our services team is the best. Our services team is the best. We have the best hacking experts, things like that. But I will say that not every services team, has members with decades and decades of experience who are regular contributors to security thought leadership and competences and are on the cutting edge of what mainframe threats are and applying that to their tooling today, right? It's not just kind of, well, let me just run a bunch of scripts. It's more, how do I keep my tooling sharp and up to date by being one of the premier thought leaders and researchers in this space, right? So I absolutely cannot recommend enough just getting a good assessment of where the mainframe stands, and even a penetration test to see realistically, as we said, a lot of IAM solutions aren't necessarily pen tested. So how do you know really where you stand or what those gaps are, to really see where your mainframe stands in terms of vulnerability, and to quantify that risk and the importance of security upwards. As we said, each team, mainframe and security, needs a champion. They absolutely need a champion. And without that, it's going to be very, very, very difficult to get a SecOps operation off the ground and really running seamlessly. All right. So, okay. So I'm sure a question many of us have at this point, as it's, it's something definitely we want to talk about, is how does SOAR fit into all of this? SOAR. Okay. So first, let's lay some groundwork. So what is SOAR? SOAR stands for Security, Orchestration, Automation, and Response. Okay. And there are specific platforms that do SOAR, that do security, orchestration, automation, and response. IBM is one, Splunk. They all have many others. They have these, what they're called SOAR platforms. So what is SOAR though? So what you see here is a picture of an orchestra conductor, right? And in an orchestra, you have multiple sections. You have your violins, your flutes, your trumpets, that if they all play at once at the wrong time, they are going to, no one's going to want to watch that concert, right? So however, what is the conductor's job? The conductor's job is to tell which part to play and when, at what tempo, to what volume, to what cadence, all of these things. That's the conductor's job. Well, a SOAR platform, if you think of the platform, think of the SOAR platform as that conductor. So for example, if I get a security incident, normally what I would do, let's say I just have a security analytics platform like AMI Command Center. I get the ticket, okay, and then I have to figure out, okay, what are the next, maybe there's other tools I have to go into to block this IP. Maybe there's other tools I have to go into, like my ITSM solution, to update the ticket. Okay, maybe there's another tool I have to go into to, let's say, update a firewall rule. That's 4 different steps I have to do manually based on one security ticket. What the SOAR platform does with integrations with all these different types of devices, such as your firewall, such as your ITSM platform, such as your EDR platform, and think of those separate platforms as different sections in the band, right? What your SOAR platform will do is it will then be the brains behind that entire orchestra. So now that security incident comes in my example, instead of me going manually into doing all those things, I say, hey, SOAR platform, I configured you so that when I get this type of ticket, I want you to automatically go into the ITSM platform. I want you to write this update. I want you to go into the firewall and then update this rule. And then I also want you to go into our EDR platform, add this indicator, and done. And I want you to do that all behind the scenes because you are connected and you are the leader of all of those different tools. And you can do that automatically for me as long as I give you the sheet music, as long as I give you the programming, right? That is a SOAR platform. They are extremely powerful when used correctly. I can say that in my old role, we use our platform to automate a lot of updates that we were doing with point and click typing manually. It was a game changer. It was a literal game changer because it really helped us save so much time. So hopefully that illustrated the concept of SOAR and how it orchestrates, again, using the orchestra analogy, orchestrates automation and response between multiple different platforms. The question I'm going to ask now is, what about the mainframe? And in my research on this topic, especially as it pertains to the mainframe, is that the mainframe is often actually left out of the band altogether. Again, if that has changed since, please, someone in the audience, please let me know. But even for IBM's SOAR platform, I did not find much of any documentation on how this SOAR is integrated, how these SOAR platforms integrate a platform like the mainframe. In other words, okay, SOAR platform is going to go into firewalls, SOAR platform is going to go into your ITSM, we automatically type this and update the ticket just on a click. But when it comes to mainframe, that's a bit of a black hole. So the importance I want to highlight here is perhaps it needs to be incorporated into orchestra. It absolutely needs to be when it comes to things like security orchestration in the enterprise. Because orchestration, SOAR, it really saves us a lot of time, really saves us a lot of manual time and work hours that can otherwise be spent on things like investigating critical incidents, tuning our tools, figuring out how to integrate them. So that being said, although the orchestration part is a bit lacking in the mainframe space, that doesn't mean we can't have automated response, and we do have automated response. In other words, through things like AMI security automated response, we can respond to the mainframe in real time. For example, let's say if we set up an alert that a specific user is attempting to access a data set that they shouldn't, we can automatically cancel their TSO session. We can revoke their ID in real time. So the mainframe, yes, of course, leaves a bit to be desired when it comes to SOAR integration. However, it is still very possible to have automated response on the mainframe. And so don't think that it's all is lost. BMC can certainly support automated response on your mainframe to have that automated security function, where even if you are not watching your alerts or if you're sleeping, it can take that action automatically to self-secure and to enable a self-securing mainframe. All right, so thank you again, everyone, so much for joining me during your lunch hour. I do appreciate it. I do truly hope that this talk was practical, it was useful for you, and that there were some things that you could bring back to your organization, whether mainframe or security, that will be of help. So I think for this juncture, I'll hand it off to our admin team for GSC, so they can go over the feedback and other housekeeping items. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Edward. That was really interesting, and I really enjoyed it, and I'd love to hear more. We don't seem to have any questions in the chat. So I think once again, I'll just remind you that the session ID is LE. The link to the feedback is in the chat, as we don't have the QR code on the front of this presentation. And it just leaves me to thank you, Edward. Thanks very much. Really enjoyed that. Oh, hold on, we've got one, sorry. In Linux Windows SecOps, there is a large number of case studies from historical hacks which allow you to create rules for detection. How do you craft ZOS detection rules that will detect suspicious behavior an attacker might use? And that's from Jake.
Yeah, Jake, great question. So just to rephrase your question to ensure I understand, the question is, how do we create specific detection rules for ZOS? And the good news is that through solutions like AMI Security, these rules can be, it comes with over 60 out of the box detection rules that are mapped to specific use cases. They're not just checking for configuration, misconfigurations are really just baseline level things, but they're checking for things like privilege escalation when it should not be happening. Or they're checking for things like anomalous logon attempts, checking for things like sensitive data set access. So with the correct solutions, you have that autonomy to, it's as simple as using a web GUI and typing in what you need to do and customizing your alerts that way. I believe another Alexi from our chat also suggested Policy Agent IDS. Policy Agent is not something I'm intimately familiar with, but it is something native to ZOS, I believe can help. But again, it's not something I'm particularly familiar with, but however, AMI Security does provide a lot of flexibility in a very, very user-friendly way to create those alerts or augment the ones that it comes with out of the box that, again, map to very specific security use cases that are based on what we've seen in the field from our penetration tests and based on attacker behavior. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Edward. Are there any more questions? Just give you a few minutes or a few seconds to type anything. Yes, BMC AIM Coralog has a normalizer and can detect anomalies. Is that AMI? Is that what that was? Sorry, BMC AMI, Andy.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Thank you, Andy. Yes, BMC AMI Security. I believe that's what he's referring to. When we acquired, BMC acquired Coralog back in 2018. We also acquired as Andrew pointed out, a security solution, a detection and response solution called AMI Security Command Center that can normalize user activity. We didn't talk about that here in the talk. Certainly, it's something I could definitely answer questions on if you'd like to learn more about later on. But the fast version of it is that BMC AIM Security is able to quickly baseline user activity and detect deviations from that. So you can automatically know when something anomalous is happening. So for example, if you have a baseline established over 1 week or a pattern of normal activity, let's call it, of user X, and you know that user X only accesses these data sets based on the pattern that you've seen over the past 7 days, then as soon as user X accesses a brand new data set they've never accessed before in their lives, you will receive an alert. You can receive an alert, you can know in real time, so you can investigate and figure out why is user X suddenly active looking at this data set? Because we don't know that based on their normalized activity, their baseline, they never do that. And these are all baselines and normalization of activity as our audience pointed out that AMI Security supports. And it goes a long way in helping to automate detection and response in your mainframe and to ensure that you have a self-securing mainframe.
Thank you, Edward. Right, well, we don't appear to have any more questions. So I think we'll probably leave it there. We've got more sessions this afternoon, so I hope you'll all be joining those. And thank you very much, Edward, again. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.